What's up, AP Psych? You survived your first unit and it is on to the next. And this unit is called the Biological Bases of Psychology. And it's basically looking at all the different ways our body and everything in our body impacts our behavior and to an extent how our behavior impacts our body. But before we go brain deep into ourselves here, we are going to spend one lecture discussing the difference between, or the debate, not the difference, the debate between nature and nurture. And why are we like that? Is it nature's fault? Is it like DNA and genes and all that stuff? Or is it the way we're nurtured and raised in our environment, our surroundings? Either way, you could say it's your parents' fault. Quite a few learning targets in here. And so let's get to it. So what's this debate that we keep talking about, this controversy? When we say nature, what do we mean? And when we say nurture, what do we mean? Nature is referring to things like the biology of your body, your actual DNA, chromosomes, genes, things like that, like the stuff that you are just born as. And then nurture is referring to the environment. And I'm not necessarily talking about the outdoor environment, although that could play a part, but I'm talking about your surroundings, your people, the people that you surround yourself with, your friends, your peers, your parents, society. Now, we might talk a little bit about the environment in terms of like, do we have access to clean water and clean air, healthy foods, things like that. So is it something like, I've got some pictures coming up. Here we go. Is it something like, again, our DNA or like our surroundings at school or the way that we're cared for growing up that makes us the way we are? A whole field of study has developed to research the influence of nature and nurture, and that's behavior genetics. As you can see, this is the study of the relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. So this field dives deep into the idea of what part of you comes from your DNA, what part of you comes from the way you're raised or the people that you're surrounded by. And a gold mine of information that contributes to this field of study is from twins. Behavior genetics often uses research on identical twins, specifically separated identical twins, and adopted children to help determine what makes someone the way they are. We'll get into each so you can kind of see how that happens. Before I go any further, let me do a quick definition of the two types of twins. We have identical twins or fraternal twins. Identical twins come from a single fertilized egg. One egg, one sperm. They came together, the traditional way, and then they split. And because that split came after the sperm and the egg met and became a little zygote, they have the exact same DNA. On the other hand, fraternal twins were, on occasion, a woman will release two eggs at the same time. And so two different sperm found them. And so, yes, they have similar DNA because it's still the same mom and the same dad, but they are no different than ordinary siblings. Their DNA is genetically similar, but not identical like identical twins. Well, behavior genetics has already determined that identical twins are much more similar than fraternal twins. You might be thinking like, Miss Russ, duh. Yes. So generally speaking, identical twins are quite similar in most ways. Things like personality, abilities, attitudes, interests, things like that. But we also can probably think of identical twins that we know in our lives that are not quite the same. Much of what we've learned about identical twins comes from a study that started in 1979 and I believe still continues today. It's the Minnesota Twins Project at the University of Minnesota. In this study, over 1,500 pairs of twins were researched, interviewed, surveyed, things like that. 74 were included were identical twins raised apart. So they were separated at birth or at a very young age, either due to family drama or perhaps adoption, all sorts of reasons why these twins were raised apart. Sometimes they knew about each other, sometimes they didn't. But what's important for our purposes is the results. And what was discovered by these separated at birth twin research studies is that they had similarities. These twins often had similarities in physical attributes. That part we know, hence identical twins, they look alike, but also in personality, abilities, attitudes, interests, and fears. And it was determined that heredity accounted for 64 to 74% of the differences seen in IQ between the identical twins. Now we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? This is a tricky one to understand. So I'm going to use some notes to help me explain this here. When someone says this, it means that genetic factors explain 64 to 74% of the differences in IQ between the twins, while the remaining percent of the variation can be explained by non-genetic factors such as environment. So if you have two twins and their intelligence levels are different, almost 74% of it is because of genetic issues or differences. And then the other percent is because of how they're raised or their schooling that they went to and things like that, or other things that contribute to intelligence. So, in a complicated way, it's not just DNA and it's not just how you're raised, it's both. Where twin studies can help us see the impact of nature on a person's development, adoption studies help us identify the influence of environment and how nurture impacts someone's development. In research on adoptees, it has been found that personality traits tend to be more similar to biological parents, indicating personality has a strong nature or genetically based component, but attitudes, values, manners, faith, politics are more similar to adoptive parents, indicating a nurture based or environmentally based component to those aspects of a person. We also know that adoptive parents tend to be often self-giving and altruistic, meaning they have these qualities where that something that drove them to want to bring a specific child into their life, and not just make a child and see what happens, if you will. And so a lot of times those traits specifically are passed on to their adopted children. Again, adoption studies show us what is culturally and environmentally determined. Now we're going to take a closer look on the nature side of this debate, how genetics influences our behavior, or in other words, heredity, what impact heredity has on who we are. So the genetic or predisposed characteristics that influence our physical, behavioral, and mental traits. I think you can scratch the and processes. That doesn't sound right to me. Um, Evolutionary psychology does this at the human species level. And evolutionary psychology has basically determined that behavioral similarities amongst humans arise from biological similarities. And that I'll put that together with something in just a second. That all human motivation, in other words, all human behaviors, derives from the desire to spread our gene pool. So think in terms of Charles Darwin, his theory on natural selection, and the idea that all animals, in this case humans, just aim to either survive themselves or make sure that their offspring survives to continue to spread their genes onto future generations. And so the idea that behavioral similarities arise from biological similarities is this idea that we all have that drive to survive or that drive to reproduce so our genes survive, and that has an impact in how we act. One example that I've probably talked about in class already is the differences between genders in terms of attraction to sake of reproduction. And evolutionary psychology would detect the pattern that men are often attracted to younger women with the motivation that they are focused purely on fertility and making babies. And so younger women will help them do that. However, women are attracted to older, more mature, or have shown patterns of being attracted to older and more mature men from the standpoint of needing support to help keep an offspring alive. Both cases, it's about continuing to spread their genes. These are reproduction differences in the behavior of attraction. But we know other examples include things like humans naturally being scared of the dark or humans naturally being scared of heights to help them survive. It's good to be scared of those things so you avoid them for the sake of your survival. However, these ideas of evolutionary psychology and only the strongest and best survive has often been used against humans as well, specifically in the topic of eugenics. Eugenics is the belief and practice of improving the human race by selective human breeding. The goal is to improve human genetics by allowing and preventing certain people to reproduce. Now, the idea is that you would encourage people with traits and qualities that other people think are good to have babies and then continuously making humans better somehow. And at the same time, you would prevent other people from having babies, and that might stop certain traits or diseases from continuing on in the human species. This idea has been used to justify the sterilization of those with mental disorders, certain genetic defects, certain diseases, and often to prevent the continuation of an entire race. If you think of intellectual disabilities, these are disabilities that are often super rare, unpredictable, things like that. But if someone had an intellectual disability, they perhaps might not be allowed under the idea of eugenics to have a baby with the idea of, well, then we'll stop this disability from ever happening again. This concept is unscientific. It's often racially based and used to discriminate and stereotype against people. And it's often led to concerns about studying and manipulating genetics today and studying genetics even in a scientific or medical with scientific or medical motivation because of the way eugenics has been misused in the past. Now we're going to change gears a little bit and look at the nurture side of the debate. We're going to look just a touch at how environmental influences impact the way humans are the way they are. This really covers the majority of the rest of this class as a whole, but we're going to look at just a few surface level ideas. This side of the debate is the idea that external factors that one experiences, family interactions, education, things like that, influence one's physical, behavioral, mental traits, and processes. And this is going deeper than just the way you're raised. We're going to look at parental influences, of course, but much more than that. First, I want to discuss experiences of all kinds and how they impact brain development. Researchers studied rats, and we'll watch this video in class, but researchers studied rats both in an impoverished environment, meaning a cage with like nothing in it other than basic food and water. And then they studied rats that were in an enriched environment, an environment that had toys, other rats, things like that. And then they compared their brain cells. And if you look at these pictures, you can see this is the brain cell of an impoverished rat, and this is a brain cell of an enriched rat. What that told researchers is that experiences help develop a brain's neural connections. That's why it's so important, starting at a young age, for people to play with young children and babies with different toys, with different tones of voice in different settings. And because the more varied the experiences, the more likely that a baby or child will develop a very strong set of brain cells. It's been found that infants that are handled more, in other words, like cuddled more, stroked more, played around with more, gained weight and developed neurologically faster. So it is babies develop healthier brains when they are interacted with quite a bit. And we know with our brain, and I'm going to talk about this many other times this unit, that you either use it or you lose it. If you are not constantly challenging your brain and trying to grow and develop your brain, the brain cells will actually die off. We also know that parents and our peers greatly influence us. We can be specific in certain categories. We know that parents influence our sense of education, responsibility, charitableness, interacting with authority, and our future plans. Our peers have a strong influence on our sense of cooperation, popularity, and how we interact among others our age. We also know about a concept called the selection effect, that kids often choose friends similar to themselves. That's normal human behavior. It's what makes you feel accepted and validated and recognized. We are social animals, and we are predisposed, here's a nurture component, an evolutionary component, if you will, to be sensitive to our peers' styles and opinions so we can figure out who we can connect with and who we want to be friends with. And then once we have done that, those people often have quite an influence on us as we become older humans. And then last but not least, we know culture in general affects cultural norms and conditions affect who we are. Behaviors, ideas, and traditions shared by a large group, meaning our culture, our society, influence what we view as normal. Things like access to nutritional food, clean water, safe living conditions, and so on impact our behaviors and development as well. So ultimately, does nature make us who we are, or does nurture make us who we are? And the answer, quite simply, is yes. See what I did there?